Okay.
All right, so this is the Lang Team Triage meeting, and let's get started with the upcoming scheduled meetings. We have three meetings listed here. However, Nico, do you want to talk about the structural equality item for a second?
Yeah, I was a little overly ambitious. I was busy all last week and I didn't have time to do any write-ups. So I think we should just defer this one till next time. And I'll try to get a nice write-up done. We started it, but only started it today, and it seemed like it wasn't going to be good enough.
Sounds good. And I'm assuming that neither of the other items would be something we'd want to move up. The Lang Team process proposal we could do later this month, but also would require prep time and would not be ready by tomorrow. Is
Yeah,
the
and
atomic
that's right. And I
is
have
the
some
atomic follow-up
ideas.
something that
I don't know. Felix isn't here. I doubt,
okay.
as far as I know, Felix hasn't had time to poke at it. I don't think we can move it up.
Okay, then it sounds like we should cancel June 16th as a meeting, and then the other two meetings can either stay as they are or get swapped depending on which one's ready by the 23rd.
That sounds right. Oh. Yep. I never got around to announcing the meeting anyway. So there you go.
That works out well.
Uh,
Then there is an item here for the meetings that we already had. I will get to the highlighted item in just a sec, but there's an entry here for meetings that we already had. And did you have a specific item for wanting to push minutes and notes? Are there minutes and notes from these meetings that we should be uploading?
Usually I try to keep them in the HackMD docs. I can probably do that as part of my post-Lang team updates. I may even have already done it, in which case they just need to be closed. I think I was hoping Esteban would write a blog post about the generators stuff, but he had some family emergencies arise, so he's been out of touch. That's okay. That can still happen later. We'll close the issues.
Okay. Then for status updates, we need to do a status conversation at some point. That said, it occurs to me that we didn't really have a status meeting last week. And I'm wondering if it might make sense for the June 16th meeting to have a status conversation if we can be ready to have that conversation. That might be a little quick to get status updates from the various projects, though.
Yeah, I
If
think it's
not,
too
then I don't
quick.
think that. If that's too quick, then we should get async status updates, but I don't think we're going to end up having a meeting about them this month.
Right. I think we were planning to just do it in July. Seems
Then I
okay.
think that makes sense. So in that case, we have more time, but nonetheless, if we can get somebody to volunteer to, this says volunteer to ping groups for status updates, but I would say ultimately, if we can get somebody to volunteer to update some of the automated scripting that we have to actively ping group Zulip streams, then that would be ideal.
Yeah, I was working with
And or
someone on that.
scrape to GitHub.
I should follow up with them maybe, because I was working with someone who was, they didn't work on that specifically yet, but that was kind of what I was leading them up to.
Okay. Is there anybody here who might be excited about helping with that effort? Because it sounds like, coordinating that is a project in and of itself.
Yeah, triage bot hacking.
Right. I'm just acutely aware of the fact that even when we managed to find somebody to get the task done, it feels like, Nico, you're still on the hook for coordinating it. If we can find somebody to step in and coordinate, then that would more effectively distribute the load.
Agreed.
So if anybody's interested.
One thing I will say is if we go send pings, I mean, we could send pings now, but it's kind of early for a July discussion. So
right. I think it makes sense to send them a week in advance, and then any follow-up that is provided during that week, we discuss in a meeting the following week.
A good idea would be to open a PR just writing out the process which isn't that complicated, but where to look for the list and all that kind of stuff. So
Right. Mark, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to note that I think part of the problem with in terms of coordination is that I think the pinging is actually not that hard. It's mostly routine, like almost anybody can do it. But the hard bit is that a lot of the time I think we sort of see the groups either don't necessarily have a good notion of what they want to contribute and like don't really know what is being asked, or need some mentoring to get them along, and that's a relatively difficult thing to delegate to anyone.
yeah, I didn't want to bring it up at this moment, but something that's been a little on my mind is that, so first of all, there is a template for this, which was meant to kind of help prod groups with what to supply, but that really better would be if groups had like just a scheduled meeting with their shepherd to talk things out, and the shepherd brought the notes to the meeting. That seems more distributed and more like it gives at least some amount of contact from the Lang team on a regular basis. So that was something I had thought about discussing in with the process proposal or at some other future point. But I think that would be a better system overall, and maybe it's worth talking about.
Yeah, that does seem true. In any case, I think we can move on. I don't know if we have a volunteer for this cycle, but I think just pinging, I don't know, doesn't seem difficult. I think I
Yes.
could take on just the pinging, but not chasing people.
Right. Why don't we just, yeah, let's hold up and discuss it on Zulip, because now I'm thinking, well, maybe we can make this other system work for next time. It's not still fairly far away, so I think that will be better.
Okay, I'll follow up on Zulip then.
Yeah, okay.
All right, next up, we have the action item review. Just as the usual standing note, please take a look at the action item list, see if there's any outstanding items for yourself that are either done but not marked as done or have not yet been done. I know I have a couple of these myself. And next up, pending language team project proposals. So I don't think we need further conversation on Lang Team 86. The write-up is started, but is still ongoing and no progress since then. And then the negative impulse integrated into coherence is new. The current status of this is that somebody already seconded it. Anything to be discussed about this? We actually briefly saw this last week, I believe, and Nico, since you weren't here, we ended up mostly skipping over some of it. We talked about it a little bit, but if there's more you want to add, please, by all means.
Well, I don't know what you said last time, but the idea here is to support the ability to write negative impulse, which we now have, but allow it to, I guess, like it says, be integrated into coherence. It's a fairly conservative approach. I'm working a little with Jane on implementing it. The motivation is that it's really needed to overcome some of the like limitations around the what do you call it? The prelude, or sorry, my brain is not working today. The state, the ALEC core split, what do they call it? The facade, the standard facade. So I guess I would probably say, like, I feel good about going forward with it. Obviously, there would be an RFC before it could be stabilized.
Right.
And before, when we get far enough, I think I think the design is clear enough in my head for what I would want to do that we could write an RFC now, but just haven't had time.
I'm looking, sorry, this is the first time I've looked at this issue. This looks like a thing that I would have expected to handle with specialization before. That's not a, like.
I don't know why. Maybe this
Oh,
specific example.
I'm
trying to
sorry,
remember.
To clarify, I'm not saying that like I think specialization is the right tool for this. I'm saying that like the thing that you're trying to write in the downstream crate looks like a thing that I would have like traditionally, if someone told me they wanted to write that in Rust, I would have told them that the tool they were waiting for was specialization, where you have like a specific type impl and a blanket impl that are potentially overlapping, right?
Yeah, there's some overlap with specialization. In this case, it doesn't it's not a specialization
Right.
because, right.
Yeah, I understand that this is sort of a different special case because you're not actually specializing the blanket impl. This is giving you the information to know that the blanket impl doesn't apply, which is a little bit of a different thing. It's sort of closer to what we have with like fundamental traits and fundamental types.
Yeah, that's right.
But also like, I don't know, this looks, this like sort of shape of thing where you have a blanket impl and then also like more, you want to write some more specific impls for specific types. Like, it would be kind of nice for that to just like work, I guess. I don't know what I'm saying necessarily, other than that, like there are a lot of times where I wanted to write this type of code and building intuition around like when I have to write default versus not, and when I want a negative impl versus a specializing impl, like, I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. I mean,
intuitive.
maybe it's an interesting point in that we have some specialization soundness bugs and other things. Like there's a need to prioritize progress towards specialization, and I'm definitely in favor of making like these kind of impls, figuring out if we can make them just work, so to speak, so that you can write them and it's sort of like, well, it will be specialized if it needs to be and not otherwise and stuff like that. And maybe it'd be better to prioritize that. Is that kind of your case? Is like maybe we should prioritize rounding off and trying to find a minimal set of specialization that is both, you know, addresses some of the open holes and supports this use case?
I definitely want that to exist. I don't know whether I think it's right to prioritize it above it in this specific case. I haven't, like I said, I just looked at this issue for the first time, so I'm not sure that I understand fully the motivation for this unblocking this specific case.
So these two things are fundamentally different in the sense that specialization is about implementation, like having a better implementation in some cases, whereas the negative implementation is about API, where you promise as a trait that we will never implement this trait for this type, right?
I think I don't agree with that in this case. I think, so I don't know, I've given some examples before, but I think a lot of my personal uses of specialization fall into more API-like things where I just, because of the shape of my types, I'm either trying to write like a recursive impl or something, and I can't prove some bit of negative information. So I need either some kind of like overlapping impl or like, well, like we were talking about before, the sort of that things like the default for zero length arrays, right, are the sort of things where like that I hit when I want specialization, and this feels like along a kind of similar line to those things where I have like a thing that the compiler doesn't know isn't an overlap, and so I'm happy to like slap a default on, but or maybe it even is technically an overlap, but that's like not interesting to me from an API perspective. I don't know if this makes any sense.
But if you have like two crates, A and B, where B needs to implement something but isn't possible because A might do it, right? Then with the negative implementation, that's something you apply in crate A, where it can add a promise. Whereas with specialization, that's something you can use in crate B to overcome this problem. So in this case, we want to add these promises to the standard library. So we need to use this negative implementation feature, whereas with specialization, you're just giving the tools to the user to work around the problem, right?
Well, I think there's something worth capturing there. The example you just gave, Mara, I think it is possible in some cases that you would be doing negative impl in crate B to say this thing that I'm writing that the compiler might otherwise think might overlap, I'm going to declare a negative impl that prevents it from overlapping by stating that my crate has this specialized thing for which I will never implement this other trait, and therefore there is no overlap. I actually understand, I appreciate you, Taylor, spelling out exactly what the case was, because I have run into that case where I thought I wanted specialization, because really I needed to teach the compiler, even though you think this overlaps, it actually doesn't. And I can imagine this being, frankly, a more convenient way to use that use case. If what I really want is, hey, no, this doesn't actually overlap, I'd rather just tell the compiler this doesn't overlap, rather than very carefully using specialization to say it's okay that it overlaps.
But I think it's different. Then you're actually combining specialization and negative implementation. Then you're saying like specialize this and this part is not happening, right? Then your negative implementation is a specialization by itself.
Sorry to drive away from this for a second, but I'm actually wondering, so the reason that we want this particular impl is that we want it to live in stud rather than core?
Correct.
Or in alloc?
Correct.
And
So the
reason we can't do that is because stir can't implement error on its own because it can't allocate.
Correct.
So if we had a way to spell that, no, that's not right.
I think error would be in stud or in core, if I understand, but box is not. So the
I think that is the point, though, that
the from impulse. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, I see.
I'm not sure which impl. I guess I don't know which impl you meant when you said this.
I'm saying, sorry. So if stir just implemented error, you would get the lower case, right?
Yeah, if it implemented error.
Yeah, but we want to guarantee that we will never do that.
Why is that?
Because
no, I'm saying like why is this being done rather than having stir implement error?
Well, we don't want stir to implement error. It's not an error type.
I think part of the reason is that it doesn't. I mean, that seems like a good thing to take to the project group, but like,
okay,
I think it's partly a matter of it not having the various bits of metadata that it's supposed to have.
But box dyn error constructed from a stir wouldn't either, right?
Yeah, but that's a bit more explicit than directly using the stir.
I don't know. You should ask Jane. I forget. I'm sure there's a reason, but yeah. I will point out though that I mean, there's definitely a difference between. I think we should move on, but there's definitely a difference between specialization. Like, you don't need a default, right? If you know that the impl doesn't exist, and that could be important in some cases. It's probably not. It's not here. I don't think in particular, but like with associated types or something else, you might want to be able to.
Yeah, you might want it to be clear whether an impl is always being applied or not. And in this case, it's helpful to have that extra information. And then in other places, I can see it being useful that you have default as an explicit flag that for some types that implement error, this isn't actually the impl that will be applied. So
yeah, part of that's right.
One of the examples I put in the issue, I think, is that there might be options of removing some weird fundamentals with this as well.
That is my hope, that I kind of want to replace fundamental with, I don't think we can necessarily do it entirely, but I would like to move to a more principled notion of
yeah, box might have to stay fundamental, but the example I thought was interesting was that saying no, stir is not a function.
I've always been really sad that RC and ARC weren't fundamental and can't be made fundamental because backwards compatibility.
Yeah. I think there's some types where fundamental makes sense. I'm not sure that like the traits that are fundamental, that makes quite so much sense. Like right now, the comment on FN1 says, the comment on FN1 says that this is fundamental so that grep can rely on stir not being FN once or something.
Regex, but it was basically so that you can write. It's really more generally so that you can have functions that take either a closure or a value. But in practice that was stir. Whether that's still true is not entirely clear.
Two things regarding fundamental. Has there been ever any discussion of being able to generalize fundamental to something that could be used outside the standard library? As in, here is a
That's what
very
this is.
careful.
It's
Okay.
not a generalization of fundamental, but it's a handles some subset of those cases in a principled way.
Right. So that much seems true. I think I'm more getting at, is there theoretically a way we could define a trait or a property that sufficiently carefully defines what properties we need of a fundamental type that it then becomes possible to declare your type as fundamental that is some container around a T? Or is that just too concerning to consider extending outside of the standard library? Like, suppose, for example, somebody was building their own specialized variant of box and they wanted the same property box has.
Yeah, I think we could talk about it. It's not been discussed too much. I'm a little wary about it, but I just don't like fundamental that much. So I'd hope that, but I think it'd be a good thing to discuss, because I would hope that along the way we might find a alternative framing that we prefer to fundamental.
Okay. One other thought on this. I recently started working with a group of people, and that opportunity may provide a way by which I can get somebody working on the problem of merging core, standard, and ALEC. And there's some interest in doing that. I wanted to bring that up in the context of, if that were the case, would that remove the primary motivation for this, or is there still interest in this even if we didn't have the problem with core Alex did?
I mean, I've been interested in this for a long time, just because I want to do things like implement for all copy types and for spec, stuff like that.
And like add strings.
Yeah, there's various. I don't have a exhaustive list of use cases, but being able to just affirm that something will not be implemented and then rely on that seems useful. However, whether it's the most useful thing, like I see Taylor's point that maybe a pushing on specialization might be more valuable use of time.
I'm sorry to take us on that weird train. I think I was just trying to express I have times in Rust where I want to write an impl that like is clearly sane in my head, but
yes.
Like can't convince the compiler. And it seems like we're like developing like at least 3 different tools for like getting around that. And
I would
kind of
definitely
like it to just work. I don't know.
I would like it to just work. There's some there's some limits to how far you can push that, but
yeah, I think that's me asking for vaporware almost, like.
Sure.
But
well, this concept seems fundamentally reasonable. I think I was purely asking a prioritization question of is this still high priority if we
I mean,
if
Jay
we
would
have
probably lose interest in pushing on it, at which point it probably would stall.
This I don't know. Personally, this seems much easier to land than like core Alex stood merging seems like
oh, that much is fair. I mean,
like, it's a good thing to work on, but like I don't know what the heck a design for that would look like. Like I have a bunch of really specific technical questions about how that would work, and seems like it would take a lot longer to resolve than like, hey, negative impulse, we have them now, and you can do coherence with them.
Yeah, especially given that we already have negative impulse as a thing, and a bunch of the rules are already in fact implemented for them because we added them when we did the negative impulse for ampersand mute and things. So like we've had other related things to this, and I think part of it also sort of to what Taylor was saying about this seems easier to land than specialization. This might also give us ways to get into specialization, avoiding some of the hardest parts of it. That if that part of the note on this, as I recall, is like, we don't want to allow you to do negative bounds by the absence of a positive bound, but we might be able to do negative bounds by the explicit presence of a negative bound in a way that's much less scary. And that might potentially give a way to make a bunch of the easy cases or a bunch of the common cases for specialization not too scary. Like if we let people say, well, you're allowed to implement for, you know, clone plus not copy as long as you have a implementation for copy or something.
We're 30 minutes into the meeting, so I do think we should.
Yeah, I think we should move on. But in general, this seems like a reasonable proposal. I'm glad it's seconded, and I look forward to seeing how that pans out. So we have 5 open PRs on the Lang team repo. These are largely design notes. They've been previously discussed, and I think they just need to be pushed over the finish line. Unless somebody has something to jump in and chime in on those, I think we can move on and handle them async.
Yes, I think so. I mostly put the assignees just to nag people.
Seems appropriate. In 2 cases, that would be nagging yourself.
That's right.
So next up, we have proposed FCPs. So we have, first of all, calling methods on generic parameters of const funds. This is 2632. I don't want to spend an inordinate amount of time on these since they are in FCP, but this one in particular looks like it is quite an old FCP and may need to be revived at some point.
I feel like we talked about closing this and encouraging Ollie to reopen it. Is that not wrong?
I thought this was the one that we were, well, so this is the one that's blocked on a concern that Bode's filed, right?
Yeah, Nico is supposed to talk to, I think, Ollie or someone.
Yeah, I think I have a
group.
pending action item on that.
If there is already an action item on this, then I would suggest we move on.
Yeah.
Because I think that the rest of us had all checked our boxes already, but like more than a year ago, right?
Well, I would say, regardless of that, even if we do end up with deciding to make forward progress on this one, if it has been a year since we last checked boxes, I think it is appropriate to review and confirm what it was we signed off on again. But yes, we should still sort that out and make sure that we are making forward progress on it.
Yep.
So can we confirm that there is an action item in the action items list for that?
I'll make sure there is. I'm not seeing it immediately, but I think it's
I found it.
Okay.
I found it. It's 2021-0601. Nico to suggest a new thread or repropose that.
Okay,
So yes,
cool.
there's an action item. Okay, let's move on then. Next up, we have add target configuration to 991. We discussed this briefly before, and then I also added a comment to the thread that it might make sense to not do this and instead just have a shorthand syntax for matching all the components of the target triple. And then Mara had a specific comment regarding when it may be convenient in the case of specific targets to work with that. How do we want to make forward progress on this? Do we think the right answer is to go forward, or is the right answer to drop this and propose an FCP to close? Or what do we think the right answer is overall?
Do we foresee a lot of negative consequences of permitting one to match the complete triple?
Say that again.
Like if we accepted it as is, do you foresee negative consequences? Like people will become over specialized on exact target triples?
I think that was always the concern, is that if people can match the whole target string and they're used to target strings, that may be okay in the narrow case where they really do only run on 1 or 2 targets. But in the broader case, they may use target strings when they should have matched on something narrower and end up being less portable than intended, for example. There was also the concern, which came up last week, so I'm bringing it up again for anybody who wasn't here last week, that it seemed like a lot of the interest in this was heavily about WASM 32 unknown and matching it because it is incomplete and stubbed out for std. And if we if that's the only concern, having a shorthand to make that easier doesn't seem like we need to add fully general match the whole target triple support when you could just say, well, if I'm target family WASM and OS unknown.
I want to say something about the portability concern. So you're saying that you're concerned about people being too specific when it could be more like less restrictive in their configure attributes. But I think the opposite is also a concern. If someone specifically has like some inline assembly with platform specific function that it calls, it only works on one specific target, but they need to write it out as a combination of like target OS and target whatever, then they might accidentally become not restrictive enough, right? And I think that's a problem in some places like compiler built-ins or some other things I've worked on, where I really wanted to make sure that it only compiles on one very specific target, because for everything else, I didn't even try what it does. And there
that's absolutely possible.
And I couldn't convince myself there that what I wrote would exactly only match that one target and not maybe accidentally something similar. So I think the concern also holds in the opposite way.
It absolutely is, yes. I think the question then becomes, is matching on the whole target a net positive or a net negative? People are certainly used to those for all the good and bad that they are. And do we want this or do we want components?
Why not support both?
I think that's exactly the question and concern here that we're trying to sort out. The advantage to supporting both is people can use whatever is more convenient, whatever they're used to. The disadvantage is they may use what they're used to, even if it's not the ideal solution. Like if you're used to target strings because you come from the C and configure and autoconf world, then you may use a target string because that's more recognizable than the names for the components and the more verbosity for the components. And then you end up matching more specifically than you otherwise could have.
But that's always
that's not a deal breaker. That's just, that is one of the potential negatives. The question is, does that outweigh the positive of let's give people the option?
I think it's actually safer that they don't accidentally match something they didn't.
Right. I don't find that very persuasive. I would say if you were going to land one, then it's a concern of some kind. If people, I don't really have a very strong opinion about this, but is there a lot of bike shedding? Like, it doesn't seem hard to support them both. And I think for me as a user, I would definitely prefer if I don't have to match the whole triple, because that's always, I'm more in Josh's camp of like, usually I want Windows or something and not something very
well, I don't usually want to match the whole triple either, actually. The one other thing that seems worth bringing up here is I don't think that this is likely to be an issue for the common case of here is a target where two of the components actually matter. Like if you have x86 unknown Linux GNU, nobody cares about the unknown and Linux GNU is straightforward enough. I'm more thinking of cases where target strings have been abused over time because things don't fit into neat little triples or quadruples or whatever you want to call them. So there are all sorts of platforms like ARM or RISC-V or similar where many details have been wedged into them, like ARM EL unknown Linux GNU EABI, where the ABI has been wedged into the last component. We have parsed that out in various ways to make it so that you don't have to match GNU EABI. You instead can match that as though it were Linux GNU and that there was this separate flag that says I'm EABI. We have logic in our parsed out version to handle that, but that's not something we can expect of people who are dealing with target strings. So that's my concern, would be all the squirrely little flags that people wedge into a target string that we currently know how to handle by matching them inside the compiler.
But I specifically want to match on GNU AIB HF when I'm doing floating point stuff. I want to know it's GNU, and I want to know that there is the hardware floats available, etc.
That's absolutely fair. Yeah, I'm not suggesting that that's wrong. I'm suggesting that's the case where it's likely to really matter which one you use, and it's easy to get wrong. It might also be exactly what you want.
So I say we.
Anyway, I don't.
I feel like we should just suggest to support both. Doesn't seem very hard to do, so I don't know what's the resistance.
Because
say
this is often on the more advanced feature, because for the more advanced one, you need to split all this stuff. And then for things like new ABI, like how do you split it exactly? And that's going to take a lot of bike shedding, whereas matching on the full target is pretty trivial to just accept and implement right now.
How much bike shedding is going to take? Like, it doesn't seem that hard. We have already, I thought we have some logic around this, is what Josh was saying.
Well, that's, yeah, actually, I'd like clarification about this particular point, because you're saying, why don't we do both? What do we already have in the compiler? Don't we already have the split out version? This is just talking, this RFC is just talking about adding the target.
So we do have the split out version. However, we don't have any kind of shorthand to make that easier. So right now, if you want to match 2 or 3 components of the split out version, it is sufficiently annoying to do so and verbose to do so that if people have the option of matching the target, they may do so just for the brevity, not for actually needing to do so. Part of the motivation for adding a shorthand is let's make it easy to do the right thing, whichever the right thing is, without feeling like, well, this is the right thing, but this is the easy thing.
What do you have to do now?
Right now, you'd have to do config all target OS is this, and target family is this, and target this is this.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's target arch, target vendor, target OS, target env, right? Is that
Yeah.
all?
I think there might be a 5th
Target
one.
ABI.
Target family, I think.
So I thought
Oh,
we were
yeah,
just going to
target ABI
expose
as well.
those things as with a different syntax.
Right. So the proposal was to add a shorthand that amounts to target with parens that is the equivalent of all. And inside it, you can write all of the target underscore things without the target underscore.
Right. So there's not really a lot of bike shedding required. Like the bike shedding has been done.
No, I think there's a really obvious proposal. And I have a concern registered on the RFC that amounts to please add that proposal. At this point, I personally would be happy with going forward with let's allow both, and let's specifically request that the RFC also specify the shorthand version. I'd be happy to move forward with that and not block on the basis of people might do the wrong thing, as long as the option to do the right thing, whichever one the right thing happens to be, is there, and it's just as convenient either way, then I don't think we need to block doing full target strings.
So you're not proposing to expose any more information than right now, just a shorthand for exactly target OS, target family, etc.
Exactly. Anything target underscore could be matched inside of target parens without the underscore.
But if you want to match
Target
on
underscore.
those extra flags you just mentioned, that's currently just not possible, but that's something for a later RFC then.
No, I think it would be if you have target ABI, you'd be able to just do ABI.
But do we have that right now?
I think so.
That's what Mark said, but
I definitely recall an issue or a PR suggesting to add it. I don't know whether it actually happened.
I would say like my
Yeah,
version would be yes,
RFC
that should be
2992.
separate. We shouldn't extend the set of things we parse now. We should just give a more convenient way to access them.
Yeah.
We can have a follow-up RFC to extend it if desired.
Yeah.
So yeah, there is target ABI specified in an RFC. I haven't dug through the tracking issue to find out if somebody's implemented it.
Okay, so it sounds like there's no objections. Then we should move forward.
On the being specific thing, of course, that always depends on whether you're doing negatives or not.
Sorry?
If you do not windows versus not a whole target triple, the which is more specific is the other way around.
Yeah.
That seems true, but
But
that might be good.
not
maybe.
really any different from all the other things, like
right.
people
Doing
matching on
nothing.
not Linux.
all right, 15 minutes left and we've not yet gotten to the nominated things. Keep moving. But it seems like we resolved
Let's
this
go
one,
on to the
which is
next
good.
one, and I will take the action item to write a summary of the consensus and propose that the RFC add the shorthand syntax.
All right, and just for the record, consensus, since we went this whole discussion, is
Allow both
shorthand
and
syntax,
add the
right.
shorthand.
Allow matching exact target triple. Introduce shorthand syntax to access existing target underscore XXX variables. Okay. Great.
All right, let's move on then. We have the tracking issue for config version. This is 64796. There appears to continue to be ongoing progress on specifying a small subset of config accessible that is implementable. There's ongoing discussion in this regard. So I don't think that there's a blocker here. I think that people are trying to make this work.
All right, great.
That said, I should point out, I don't know how much implementation energy there is at the moment. And if anybody's excited about seeing that subset of accessible implemented, they might want to poke the people who are excited about them and see if any of those folks want to do the implementation, or if there's just a bunch of people saying, yeah, that sounds good.
Sounds like
It's
we need
not
a
obvious.
mentor. We need mentoring
Yes.
instructions. Okay. We should add this to the project board. Okay.
Yes.
Josh,
But
can
I
you-
think
or
at this point
Mark,
there
can you
is
put that
a-
as an action item.
I think at this point there is a very concrete proposal and not a lot of remaining bike shedding. The proposal pretty much amounts to allow config accessible on things where the path starts with one of the standard crates, standard alloc or core, or proc macro for that matter, and just allow that as a subset of what we might theoretically allow in the future. I don't think there's any further bike shedding going on, so it really is just a matter of someone implementing this. If there's nothing further on that one, then I think we can go on to 81360, support forwarding caller location through trait object method call. Anybody have the background to discuss this one? I know a little bit about it in terms of the performance implications, but...
So short version, we added track caller. You can use it almost anywhere, but you can't get it through dynamic dispatch. The way that it works is it adds a little extra information to the ABI, an implicit parameter that identifies the call site. And what this PR does is say, if you've put that attribute in the trait, we will add that extra ABI information into the vtable so that you get it also through dynamic trait object access. If you put that attribute on, not on the trait, but just on an impl, which already is possible, then I think all these things are already possible. It's just that what happens today when you put the attribute in those places is that you don't get the more precise caller through vtable dispatch. You just get it if you do static dispatch. But if you don't put the attribute on the trait, you won't get it through virtual dispatch, even if the impl has it, because we wouldn't have added it into the vtable. The vtable is determined by the trait definition. There's really no other implication for users that I'm aware of.
Just to check, if you put it on the trait but not the impl, what happens here?
I believe it gets inherited by the impl automatically.
Okay, so if it's on the trait, putting it on the impl makes no difference, or does it only make no difference when it's going through dynamic dispatch?
I'm checking. I'm trying to refresh that in my memory now. It might be that we generate a stub to drop the input. No, I'm pretty sure if you put it on the trait, it makes no difference whether the impl has it or not. The only
Do you require that you have it on the impl then?
Plausibly.
We don't want to do that because it's backwards incompatible then to add it to the trait, which I think is a problem because it's added to things like index today.
Sure.
Yeah,
well, that much is true. Well, that much is true that we don't want to make it right. The question is, do we want to drop it if you do static dispatch, or do we want to include it if you do static dispatch because one way or another, either way, people could come to depend on that behavior and we may not be able to change it later.
I think we
People-
should just warn,
too late.
but also if you're calling location caller in a method like that doesn't have track caller in it, like what the heck are you doing? I
Right.
don't know.
I think we
This
could
is
warn.
that's actually really fair.
We could warn,
Warnings make a lot of sense.
but also we've already that all stuff is, as far as I know, all that stuff is already sort of stable and out there. So
Yep,
this is
that
like-
seems fine.
Wait, I don't know if Taylor's argument there quite makes sense, because I can imagine an implementation, like the whole point here is, yeah, you put it on the trait, you have many implementations, one of them doesn't include location caller and isn't using location caller, and yet they're paying the cost, even in static dispatch, of having track caller on it, right?
It's not a very big cost.
No, it's not. I'm just saying,
No, but-
the logic there, I was trying to work my way through and it didn't make sense to me in terms of like,
So-
there's,
That actually does make sense in that we should at the very least allow the compiler to be able to optimize that away for static dispatch at the very, whether it inlines or whether it simply like calls into a later piece of the function. It's theoretically possible for the compiler to optimize static dispatch to not care if it knows that the callee doesn't care.
It seems like an optimization. I agree.
Sure.
We could also allow people to explicitly opt out at some point in the future, but these all seem like none of these seems. I don't think we should burden this FCP with these proposals.
No, none of
Yeah.
these seem like blockers.
yeah, it's
And-
fine. We don't need to require a track caller on the impulse for this. Yeah, I'm fine with an opt-out later on.
I would like to see somebody give me any evidence that there's a performance hit before we did that.
There is actually some evidence that there are performance hits in that we have had PRs to the compiler to add, or rather the standard library, to add track caller to more methods. And when track caller is added to especially hot methods in the standard library, then the perf test suite does turn up some hits, some regressions. So it is not free. It is
Is that
worth it in many cases, but it's not free.
That's a perf test suite cost, as in the compiler, that's the compilation time itself. It's hard to evaluate here where
Yes.
the cost is coming from exactly, right? Because it could be the standard
That's
lot.
true. It could be that the compiler got slower because of track caller, or it could be that the compiler is having to generate the code for track caller and that takes longer.
Yeah,
So
Anyway, I
fair
don't
enough.
dispute that it's possible that there's a perf hit. I'd just like to see it. Yeah, good call, Felix. I don't. I'm still unconvinced.
we need better benchmarks.
Yeah.
We really do. Also,
Yeah.
just out of curiosity, what is the word being used in the minutes here that I didn't say, but I imagine this means something?
It's a German word. It means no, I guess, but it's specifically for when you're sort of in this scenario where you're like disputing the thing I said, saying that's not true.
Okay, good to know. I learned something today.
Such a useful word. You could also think of it as nah.
Okay. Next up, unless anybody has something more to add to that, then stabilize RFC 2345, allow panicking in constants.
So last time I put this, or this has been here, but I put this note. We have this addition. Mara pointed out that this is like block doesn't work well with the addition. I propose we close this issue and request a new, like we're not ready to stabilize. I think we should take it off our bucket and ask someone to follow up with a plan of how to manage the new addition.
What
Any
is
objections?
what is the context here?
Sorry. So panicking in constants is supported now, and there was a proposal to stabilize it. However, the panic macro, with the new addition, it desugars to, it always uses the formatting machinery, which is not constable or whatever, const safe. And so that means that you actually could only do this in older editions, which seems not great. So
Or by calling panic any?
I'm not sure whether that actually works, but in principle, yes. So what I'm proposing is this is a blocker for stabilizing. We should figure it out and come back once it's fixed and talk about stabilizing.
So why is this a blocker for stabilizing as opposed to just saying, let's make this work and then we can add like panic stir to do a const string or eventually stabilize constant format machinery? Why does
Well,
this need to
I
be
just
gated?
didn't want,
gated?
I don't love the idea of something working in 2018, but not 2021.
That's fair.
We promised to provide automatic migration for everything that works in the current edition, not the next. So
Yeah, that's another
also
point.
add a
Should
migration.
we add some manner of panic stir function or add some kind of fix to panic? I mean, I'm not trying to go
Panic
into
stir
detail
literally
on.
already exists and works. It's just dock hidden and unstable.
I see. Is it possible to teach panic with no extra arguments to do that?
Yes, and that's exactly what we undid in the new edition, because that opened up a huge can of worms with all kind of problems with the panic macro that we had in current edition, right?
I mean, I think we're talking about panic with no string, or
Panic
sorry, I'm
with a
confused.
panic with a string but no format arguments.
Okay.
Is there any reason we couldn't have that translate to panic with a stir as a
That's
function?
Because-
The answer is
exactly
yes.
what it is right now.
Interpolation.
That's exactly what we changed, yeah, in 2021. Because it was, the way to do that was it wound up accepting a bunch of other things too.
Well, yeah, no, not panic any. I'm talking about having a function that only takes stirs.
Yeah, that function exists. That's used in core because panic any doesn't exist in core. So the core panic macro currently, if you only give it the literal no arguments, it forwards to panic str, which only accepts a string, but it doesn't process any formatting arguments. So if you put a brace in there, then it just accepts it. And if you put an escape brace in there, then it just shows both braces.
I see.
All kind of other problems. But yeah, that function exists, so we could expose it, but I'd rather just make the macro work for.
Right. Okay.
Well,
So
I'm not sure about
treat this as
which
a-
approach I'd rather have, but I just feel like this is like, this conversation should go back to, we don't have a solution to this problem. It's a blocker for stabilization.
And what I forgot to mention last time, there were lots of suggestions for just making it work with panic any and nothing else. We had that before, sort of. The problem is that panic any only exists in stud and not in core, and lots of people writing constant stuff are using no stud. So
wait, panic any only exists where?
In a SCD, it's not in core because it allocates. And yeah, people really want to do const panic in no stud stuff.
So I think I'm convinced at this point that that's a blocker. Does that need to mean that we close this, or can we simply leave the concern and say this is blocked on this change? We will stabilize once somebody comes up with a solution for that.
I guess my take is, I mean, we could do either. I sort of view this issue as like a decision. I guess there's sort of a procedural thing, but I'd rather not have issues just proliferate. If
Sure.
we can't move forward, we can close the issue, but have a link in
if
the
we want to
tracking
move-
that says, you know, for historical records, we're ready to go forward, but we have to resolve this issue.
Right. I think if this is treated as a decision, then ideally we could record the decision of we are in support of doing this once this blocker is removed, rather
Yes.
than just dropping the closing and not recording that consensus.
I agree. That was part of my.
Okay, as long as that's captured,
explicit,
then.
But yes, that it was.
As long as that's captured, I don't care if we close.
Okay. Yep. Okay, good.
Okay. Let's see if anybody want to jump ahead before we talk about.
We're out of time.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll sort better next time, I guess. Thanks everyone. We did resolve a bunch of thorny stuff today, though.
We did.
Great. Ciao.
Bye.